By the start of the 19th century, the British East India Company had become the dominant power across the subcontinent, expanding in every direction. Britain came to realize the vast productive potential of India and sought to protect this asset by any means necessary. At the same time, Russia's imperial expansion started to gain real momentum by the 1820s, as it sought to make its way south beyond the Caucasus Mountains. Although not anywhere near the Indian border, Russia's rise worried the British. This great game rivalry placed the mountainous Kingdom of Afghanistan in the middle. Emerging out of the dying embers of the Durrani Empire, Afghanistan fought hard for its existence. Under the capable stewardship of Amir Dost Muhammad Khan, the country was on a steady but troubled path towards political stability. But their destiny would be disrupted with multiple invasions from the British in the south and a wariness of Russian incursions in the north. Over the course of 3 wars starting in the 1830s and extending until 1919, we'll learn of the greatest military disaster faced by the British Empire, the intrigues of an Afghan ruler who tried to play European powers against one another, and even an invasion of British India by the Afghans. This is the story of the Anglo-Afghan Wars. The beginning of the 19th century was a time of great turmoil in Afghan politics. The Durrani Empire, established by Ahmad Shah Durrani, had descended into civil wars as his grandsons fought one another for supremacy. As the brothers competed with one another, the empire established by their grandfather dwindled until all that was left was Afghanistan. In the east, the Sikhs had become formidable foes to the Afghans, wresting control of Punjab from them. Under the leadership of Ranjit Singh, the Sikh Khalsa had even threatened the city of Peshawar, the winter capital of the Durrani Empire. In the backdrop of all this internal conflict, the Muhammadza'i family rose to important positions of power within the royal court. Although they were from the ruling Durrani Confederacy, they came from a different tribe called the Barakzai. By 1823, the Barakzai dynasty had toppled the Durrani dynasty and asserted their control over the realm. Under the helm of Amir Dost Muhammad Khan, the Afghans enjoyed greater stability and were even focused on addressing the Sikh threat from the east. As Afghanistan was sorting out its internal issues, neighbouring India was going through its own radical changes. Long gone were the days of Mughal supremacy. By the 1820s, the Marathas, who had confined the Mughal emperor to Delhi, had themselves been sidelined by the British as the dominant force on the subcontinent. Under the auspices of the East India Company, the British colonial presence in India went from strength to strength, as they created a sprawling bureaucracy and disciplined army that formed the bedrock of their political power. And they were well rewarded for it. India was rich with resources which could help the Brits bankroll their industrialization on the British Isles, as well as their colonial projects overseas. Britain's main competitor in Europe in this period was Russia, which had similar aims of colonial expansion. The Russians had pushed their borders southward into the Caucasus Mountains, but were yet to make forays into Central Asia. Nevertheless, the British still feared Russian designs on India, regardless of their feasibility. There were worries in London that Russia's desire for a warm water port could see it expand its presence towards the Indian Ocean through Persia or Afghanistan, thus bringing them into direct conflict with British interests in India. In such a political atmosphere, Afghanistan became a powder keg for the British, and any Russian interference in the country would be a cause for concern for the Viceroy in India. This rivalry was later dubbed as the Great Game. Of course, the Afghans were not passive bystanders in all of this. Dost Muhammad, or the Dost as he was known by the British, tried to benefit from the rivalry which threatened his realm by politically maneuvering between the two European powers. He could use the situation to his advantage and try to solicit the return of Peshawar to Afghan control, which by the mid-1830s had definitively fallen to the Sikhs. Considering their proximity to the Sikh Empire, Dost Muhammad preferred to side with the British over the Russians. In 1837, he wrote to Lord Auckland, the British Viceroy of India, proposing an alliance if the British would support his quest to regain Peshawar. Auckland responded with a message that would come back to haunt him, stating, "My friend, you are aware that it is not the practice of the British government to interfere with the affairs of other independent states." In order to placate the Emir, Auckland sent a delegation to Kabul headed by Alexander Burnes. Burnes had previously met the Emir 5 years before on his journey towards Central Asia, and the two got along very well. Unbeknownst to the Afghan ruler, Burnes had been given explicit instruction to not agree to any formal alliance. He was in Kabul to try to learn more about the Russian involvement in Afghanistan. With his advances being constantly rejected by Burnes, the Dost started to get frustrated. At the same time, a Russian arrived in Kabul by the name of Jan Vitkovich, who claimed to be an envoy of the Tsar. Oddly enough, Vitkovich was never confirmed to be an official Russian envoy, and would later commit suicide under mysterious circumstances. His presence in the Afghan court did, however, terrify the British, even more so when Vitkovich proposed the establishment of a Russian diplomatic mission stationed in Kabul. In a bid to force the British Viceroy's hand, Dost Muhammad leaked details of the meeting so that he could push the British into granting him the alliance that he wanted. Viceroy Auckland did not like what he heard, especially since his trusted and hawkish advisor, William Hay McNaughton, urged him to take action against Dost Muhammad. The British demanded that Dost Muhammad stop all communication with the Russians. The Afghan ruler asked the Viceroy to put the terms in writing and sign a formal alliance, to which he heard no response from India. So he met with Vitkovich again. This was the last straw. Determined to stop Afghanistan from being drawn into the Russian orbit, Viceroy Auckland decided to depose the Dost. The British position was strengthened by the fact that Shah Shuja, a grandson of Ahmad Shah Durrani and a former ruler of Afghanistan, had been living on a British pension in India and was therefore a suitable replacement for Dost Muhammad. In October 1838, the order was given to invade Afghanistan so that Dost Muhammad could be dethroned and Afghanistan could be saved from foreign intervention. The irony was obviously lost on the Viceroy. The army of the Indus consisted of just over 30,000 soldiers, with an even greater number of camp followers. Prior to moving on Afghanistan, the British had to deal with the fact that the Sikh Empire lay between it and Dost Muhammad's realm. Thankfully for the British, Ranjit Singh was more than glad to see his old Afghan rival undermined. Therefore, he had no qualms with the invading army of the Indus going through his realm. passing through the Bolan Pass in March 1839, the British were delighted that the former Afghan capital of Kandahar was taken without a fight the following month. In July, the intimidating fortress of Ghazni was taken when a young British officer named Henry Marion Durand laid satchel charges which blew the gates open. Interestingly enough, his son Henry Mortimer Durand would be the person that the famous Durand Line would be named after. By August, Dost Muhammad had fled the capital and the British triumphantly entered Kabul with Shah Shuja. Having established him on the throne, the British soon found out that Shah Shuja was a largely incapable ruler. Stories of his brutality became well known. Nonetheless, the Shah's power was limited by MacNaughton, who had accompanied the expedition as Britain's chief representative in Kabul. Burns had also accompanied the mission as MacNaughton's number 2. British garrisons were created in Kandahar, Ghazni, Jalalabad, and of course Kabul. Certain sub-tribes within the Ghilzai Confederacy were paid off by the British to keep the supply lines between Kabul and the Khyber Pass open. For the time being, there seemed to be an eerie sense of acceptance from the Afghans of the new foreign occupiers. This was not lost upon the British, who called for their families to come to Kabul, bringing amenities such as cigars and whiskey with them. The British cantonment in the capital was walled, and a community arose that sought to establish a British way of life inside of it. They had cricket matches, tea parties, and theatre shows. As for Dost Muhammad, he was nowhere to be seen. After his initial escape in 1839, the Dost had fled north to Bukhara, where he was imprisoned by the local ruler. Eventually escaping, he re-entered Afghanistan with a small force of Uzbeks. The British were disturbed by these reports, but they were pleasantly surprised in November 1840 when Dost Muhammad personally appeared before MacNaughton and voluntarily surrendered. On the back of such a commanding position, British policymakers in London felt that their aims had been achieved in Afghanistan, and there was no point in further draining the Indian treasury. Much of their forces were ordered to withdraw, leaving only a force of 8,000 in Afghanistan. In the summer of 1841, MacNaughton had written to a colleague in India that Afghanistan was perfectly quiet. Not everyone in the British camp believed this though. The British commander of the armed forces, Major General Roberts, whose son would play a leading role in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, resigned in protest of the actions taken by the British political administration. He was replaced by the elderly figure of William Elphinstone. The honeymoon period soon unravelled for the British. By 1841, Afghan discontent began to rise to the surface. The general state of security started to decline as robbers and outlaws increased their activities. To confound matters, Wazir Akbar Khan, the capable and charismatic son of Dost Muhammad, soon became a leader of the resistance. He looked to disturb the supply lines and raided roads connecting the cities. As 1841 progressed, there were episodes of attacks on British personnel in the cities as well. The gradual increase in tension and crime was an omen of the future. In a bid to save money, the British payments to the Ghilzai tribesmen for keeping the eastern supply routes open had also been cut. The tribesmen did not take this well and began routine attacks on the British supply lines. Brits inside of Afghanistan were not safe, not even in Kabul. In November 1841, there was an attack on Alexander Burnes's residence. In the months before, rumours abounded across Kabul that British soldiers were fraternizing with Afghan women. In such a highly patriarchal society, this was considered absolutely unacceptable by the Afghans. So a crowd gathered outside the house of Burnes, who had chosen to live outside the British cantonment. The angry mob wanted to express their disapproval of the foreigners. On that day, however, Burnes had been hosting a few local women in his house. The crowd became incensed by this contempt for their culture and became violent. Burnes was caught and beaten to death by the angry mob. These developments forced the British leadership in Kabul to realize the danger of the situation. MacNaughton reached out to Wazir Akbar Khan in order to negotiate, thinking that the Afghan uprising was under the prince's control. At the same time, he secretly asked the British garrison in Kandahar to come with their forces to Kabul. Somehow, Akbar Khan found out about this plan to double-cross him and ended up killing MacNaughton when they met in December. The elderly and ineffective Elphinstone was now in charge of the British in Kabul. He agreed to surrender Kabul to Akbar Khan in return for safe passage to the British garrison in Jalalabad. At the beginning of January 1842, the British evacuated Kabul and set upon their journey eastward. More than 16,000 people, with 4,500 being military personnel and the rest civilians. They had to travel 140 kilometers across the snow-capped Hindu Kush mountains in the midst of the harsh Afghan winter. What the British failed to firmly understand was that the Afghan insurrection was not engineered by or under the control of a single figure. Whilst Akbar Khan was an influential leader, the uprising was a natural outgrowth of Afghan resentment at the British occupation of their country. Therefore, the revolt was far more decentralized and unstructured than the British assumed. As a result, Akbar Khan was never in a position to guarantee the safety of the British journey from Kabul to Jalalabad, because the tribes on that route did not necessarily take their orders from the prince. Over the next week, the local tribes took up positions along the mountain range with their respective long-range Jezail rifles and intermittently opened fire on the retreating British. Between the tribesmen and the harsh cold weather, the British column was completely wiped out. The episode is often considered as the greatest humiliation faced by the British during the 19th century, and has helped Afghanistan gain a reputation as a graveyard of empires. The lone figure of Dr. William Bryden in this painting has popularized the mistaken belief that he was the only survivor from the ordeal, when in reality, several Indian sepoys reached Jalalabad over the coming weeks. Despite this disaster, the British still had garrisons in Kandahar, Ghazni, and Jalalabad. The Afghans were able to take Ghazni, but the Brits held out in Jalalabad and Kandahar, giving them enough time for relief forces to arrive from India in the spring of 1842. By this time, Lord Ellenborough had replaced Lord Auckland as the Viceroy in India, and had been given instructions by London to bring an end to the war in Afghanistan, after punishing the Afghans and reclaiming some lost glory. The already present contingents of British troops inside the country were aided by a relief column referred to as the Army of Retribution, which was instructed to march upon the capital and secure the release of British prisoners taken on the retreat from Kabul. Along the way, the British committed many acts of reprisals against villages and their inhabitants. In September, the historic bazaar of Kabul was burnt down. Having exacted their revenge and achieved their revised aims, the British completely withdrew from Afghanistan in October 1842. Shah Shuja had been assassinated earlier in the spring of 1842, and so the position for the ruler of Afghanistan was open. A position which was filled by none other than Dost Muhammad, who was released from captivity by the British at the end of the year and warned against opening up to the Russians again. Over the next 20 years, Dost Muhammad would spread his authority to all the major cities in Afghanistan. Peshawar, however, was never regained again by the Afghans. In 1863, he was succeeded by his son Sher Ali, who would find himself in a similar predicament to his father when his country once again faced the spectre of a British invasion in the late 1870s. In the years following Britain's withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1842, the Russians had steadily expanded their border southward in Central Asia. During the 1860s and 70s, the Russian Empire had swallowed up the city-states of Khiva, Khokhand, Bukhara, and Tashkent. By 1876, all that remained between the Russian Empire in Central Asia and the British in India was the Emirate of Afghanistan. This was a huge problem for the British. There had been British politicians who criticized the exaggerated fear of Russian expansion that led up to the First Anglo-Afghan War. But by the 1870s, those criticisms seemed irresponsible in light of Russian aggression in the region. The British were well aware of the Russian desire for a warm water port, something which would have required them to gain access to the Indian Ocean, a move that would undoubtedly have undermined the British position in India. To give further impetus to the prospect of a showdown in the Great Game, key changes took place within British politics in the 1870s. Benjamin Disraeli of the Conservative Party had defeated William Gladstone of the Liberals in the 1874 British elections. The new Prime Minister held a much more adventurous outlook on foreign policy than his predecessor, and sought to take a more head-on approach to countering Russian expansion. The British were not the only ones worried by these developments. The Afghan Emir, Sher Ali Khan, was keen on maintaining neutrality in the rivalry between the two colonial powers. He had shown signs of being interested in bringing reforms to Afghanistan, such as a basic postal service and military modernization. But the 19th century was a dangerous time to be an Afghan ruler. Large parts of his reign were focused on him just maintaining the security of his position. He had come to power in 1863 after the long reign of his father, Amir Dost Muhammad Khan. But just 3 years into his reign, Sher Ali Khan was forced into exile by his brother, Muhammad Afzal Khan. Crucially, Sher Ali Khan spent his time in exile in Bukhara, where with the help of Russian aid, he was able to recapture his throne in 1868. This detail would prove problematic for the British to stomach when the Emir would later profess his neutrality. Even upon regaining his throne, Sher Ali's internal security woes continued. His son Yaqub had organized a failed revolt against him, for which he landed in prison. But Sher Ali's other son, Abdullah, had proven himself to be capable and was favored by his father to succeed him. The first obvious step on the path to the Second Anglo-Afghan War occurred in 1878 when Lord Lytton, the new Viceroy of India and Prime Minister Disraeli's protege, sent the Emir a letter insisting that the rebellious Yaqub be announced as his heir instead of Abdullah. Why the British preferred one son over the other is unclear, but nevertheless, Leighton suffixed the request with a dire threat, saying, "We can pour an army into your country before any Russian soldier can help you." The letter also informed the Emir that an envoy was coming to Kabul to talk over the matter. Sher Ali, after deliberately waiting an infuriating amount of time, informed the British that he would choose his own successor, and that no such envoy shall come, but instead he would send his own men to Calcutta to talk over these demands. When the Afghan Emir's men arrived in the capital of the Raj, the British had no interest in a discussion. Instead, they listed a harsh set of demands that would have essentially transformed Afghanistan into an autonomous region within the British Empire. Sher Ali apparently flew into a rage upon hearing the terms, immediately rejecting them. He tried to reinforce his expressed desire to remain neutral and independent of the Russian and British rivalry. But his words were undermined by the fact that, unbeknownst to him, an uninvited Russian delegation had crossed into Afghanistan in July of 1878 and wanted to meet with the Emir directly. Even though Sher Ali tried to get the Russians to turn back and leave his country, his efforts proved futile. This confirmed the suspicions of the British in Calcutta. As Sher Ali was watching his country edge closer to war, tragedy hit his house. His son and favoured successor Abdullah died, sending the ruler into a state of grief which he never really recovered from. Regardless of this, the British demanded that the Emir should accept an envoy of their own to Kabul. Sher Ali ordered that the British mission be turned back at the Khyber Pass if it arrived, and that's exactly what happened in September 1878. With a Russian delegation in Kabul and a refusal to accept a British one, Lord Leighton was now convinced that the Emir had chosen a side. This episode and the subsequent refusal of the Emir to apologize for his actions was the spark to the pile of gunpowder and triggered the official declaration of war from Britain. In November 1878, a British force of roughly 40,000 men, mainly Indians, prepared to invade Afghanistan. The army was to be split into 3 columns, with one being tasked to march through the Bolan Pass and seize Kandahar in the west. A second column was responsible for securing the Khyber Pass before advancing on Jalalabad in the east, whilst the third column advanced along the Kuram Valley towards Kabul in the center. In the Khyber, the invading column was met with resistance by Afghan forces at the fortress of Ali Masjid. The result was a swift British victory, something which was replicated at the Battle of Pewar Kotal in the Kuram Valley a few weeks later. Just these 2 battles alone more or less ensured that the British path to Kabul was secure. And so Amir Sher Ali Khan decided to go north and ask the Russians for help. A request that was turned down by the Tsar's men, who instead encouraged him to seek peace talks with the invading force. At this point, the beleaguered Amir gave up. He came down with a fever and had a leg injury that turned gangrenous. The whole while he refused any medical aid, food, and water. He would die a few weeks later in February 1879. The Afghan throne then passed to his rebellious son, Yaqub. Immediately, he repaid the British trust in him. He ordered the Afghan troops to stand down and let the British peacefully march to Kabul. The first phase of the Second Anglo-Afghan War had been concluded. The Emir went in person to meet the British before they reached the capital, in the small town of Gandamak, where he famously signed the notorious Treaty of Gandamak in May 1879. According to this agreement, the Emir was to receive an annual subsidy from the British, as well as assurances of assistance in case of foreign aggression. In return, the Afghans had to pay a steep price. Yaqub Khan was to relinquish control of Afghan foreign affairs to the British Viceroy in India. He also had to accept a British mission to reside in Kabul, and perhaps most seriously, give the British jurisdiction over strategic chunks of territory such as the Kuram Pass, Pishin and Sibi in what would eventually become the northwestern frontier province and Baluchistan. The British mission was headed by two individuals, Neville Bowles-Chamberlain, an ancestor of the future British Prime Minister in the 1930s, and Sir Louis Cavenari. In July, both men, along with the entire British mission, entered Kabul on elephants, waving to the unimpressed crowd, and took up residence near the historic Bala Hisar. The Emir ensured that his British allies were doted upon lavishly and given the utmost hospitality. But the ordinary Afghans who were witnessing foreigners entering their capital triumphantly were not so warm and welcoming. This feeling extended to the Afghan troops who had gone unpaid for months because they were told there was a lack of funds, while they stood helplessly and watched the Emir spend money on his new foreign friends. Even at this stage, Cavenari had noticed the discontented murmurings of the Afghan natives. Even so, on September 2nd, 1879, he sent a letter back to Calcutta reporting everything to be well in Afghanistan. One day later, he was dead. It all began with a rumour. A contingent of unhappy soldiers had gone to Cavenari because they were told he had the funds to pay them. The soldiers broke into the British residency and began looting. This was seen by Kabuli civilians who promptly joined in as the dislike for the British had reached its boiling point. Cavenari, who for all intents and purposes seemed like quite a pompous man, believed he was well equipped to deal with the tribal Afghans considering his previous experience with the Pashtuns of the frontier. So he decided to exhibit a show of strength that he thought would impress the Afghans by climbing onto the roof and shouting down at the crowd. The angry crowd was not impressed by this lame display of courage. Now, Cavenari switched gears and ordered his few troops to fire on the angry mob. The 70 or so members of the British Residency were cut down by the thousands of angry Afghans. And so began the second phase of the war. One of the three columns of British troops that had invaded the country, led by Major General Frederick Roberts, stormed towards the capital, dispatched any tribal forces that had gathered around, and took control of Kabul. There was some confusion as to whether Amir Yaqub Khan was to be allowed to remain as Amir. For all they knew, he conspired in the assassination of Cavenari, which was not the case. The Amir resolved this debate himself, asking to be relieved of his position, and so he was sent to India to live on a modest pension. The former Amir supposedly said, "I would rather cut grass in the British camp than to be Amir of Afghanistan." The Union Jack was hoisted over the Bala Hisar fort. The British were going to rule directly until a new puppet Amir could be found. Then began the retribution. Major General Roberts took it upon himself to punish the Afghans for the killing of Cavenari, and so the citizens of Kabul were fined, some imprisoned, and several hung for their crimes. Forts and villages were razed in order to reinforce to the Afghan chieftains who was in charge. In hindsight, this caused a swelling of anger in the country instead of the desired effect of instilling fear. Whispers of Islam itself being attacked had started to circulate, and the British consummation of pig meat was a common way to get the crowds riled up. It was clear that the war was not over yet. But Afghanistan did not have an effective army. The army they did have was handily defeated at almost every corner, and so the use of regimented lines and order was thrown out of the window. Instead, the use of guerrilla warfare was the adopted strategy of farmers and tribesmen for whom fighting was not a profession but a way of life. Their fighting spirit was boosted by clerics across the countryside, such as the 90-year-old Mushki Alam, who urged Afghans to defend Islam by ridding the country of the British. Even though the guerrilla warfare was largely ineffective in terms of winning battles, it was still a grave annoyance to the British army. For instance, Major General Roberts once travelled 300 miles in 20 days with 10,000 men in the Afghan summer to relieve an Afghan siege of Kandahar. This was an amazing achievement of organisation and endurance. The only issue is, when Roberts got to Kandahar, the Afghans had already lifted the siege. So the problem for the British was not winning battles, because they had won almost every single one. The problem was the Afghans kept fighting, regardless of losing battles. Therefore, the war in Afghanistan just became a money pit which was swallowing up British India's resources. At this stage, the British started entertaining the idea of partitioning Afghanistan in a way that would benefit them. Several plans were proposed, which included the annexation of Kandahar or handing Herat over to Persia. Ultimately, the plan to partition Afghanistan was shelved for a variety of reasons, chief amongst them being the return of the Liberals to power in Britain in the spring of 1880. The returning Prime Minister William Gladstone had been a vocal critic of Benjamin Disraeli's policy towards Afghanistan and favoured a less aggressive solution. But before all of that was to be decided upon, Ayub Khan, another son of Sher Ali Khan, stormed down from Herat and led 8,000 men into the field of Maiwand, near Kandahar, where his forces attacked a 2,500 strong British force. In the west, Maiwand is best known as the battle in which the fictional Dr. Watson was wounded before he met Sherlock Holmes in the famous stories by Arthur Conan Doyle. In Afghanistan, the battle has become a symbol of national pride since the Afghans won decisively, inflicting almost 1,000 casualties on the British. According to Afghan folklore, it is said that as the Afghan line began to give way, a young woman named Malali, aged 18 or 19, grabbed the bloodied flag of her people, raised it high and shouted in Pashto, "Young love, if you do not fall in the Battle of Maiwand, by God someone is saving you as a symbol of shame." In the midst of the battle, Malali was killed, but her words and actions had spurred on her countrymen to victory. Since then, Malali has become Afghanistan's iconic heroine, its Joan of Arc. Ayub Khan tried to use the momentum of this victory to retake the city of Kandahar, but Major General Roberts had made his incredible journey to defend the city that we mentioned previously. When the Battle of Kandahar finally did take place on September 1st, 1880, it ended with a decisive British victory and Ayub Khan's army was in retreat. The Second Anglo-Afghan War was now over. The British had to decide what to do with Afghanistan. In the end, they settled on keeping the country whole and selecting Abdurrahman Khan as the new Emir. Son of a former Emir and cousin to Ayub Khan, Abdurrahman was a somewhat surprising candidate, considering he had spent 11 years exiled in Russian-controlled Central Asia. But he was going to be a perfect fit. The new ruler, who would go on to become known as the Iron Emir, accepted all the key British conditions. He did, however, express that the British must not interfere with the internal affairs of his country. As a result of reinforcing the Treaty of Gandamak, the new Emir forfeited control of his country's foreign affairs, so the British were happy to oblige to his demand. The very next year, in 1881, Ayub Khan tried to retake Kandahar from his cousin, but was defeated and subsequently fled the country. Just like his brother Yaqub, Ayub would eventually be exiled in India, where he became a pensioner of the British. As for the Russians, besides the potentially dangerous Panjdeh incident in 1885, they never again mingled with Afghanistan's affairs. In terms of who won the war, it's tough to tell. Both sides gained something from the conflict. The Afghans gained clarity and a peace of mind that the British would not intervene in its domestic affairs, whilst the British gained a neutral buffer state between itself and its rival Russia. But both sides paid dearly for what they received as well. The British lost men and resources, whilst the Afghans had their sovereignty undermined by the loss of control over its foreign affairs, not to mention the loss of territory in the south and east, which the Iron Emir would put pen to paper on to make an official border in 1893 under the Durrani Agreement. Throughout the 19th century, Britain and Russia engaged in what historians refer to as the Great Game, whereby the two sides vied for domination over Persia and Afghanistan. For Britain, India was the jewel in the crown, so a potentially hostile neighbouring Afghanistan was unacceptable. Twice during the 19th century, Britain invaded the rugged country, both times getting their fingers burnt. The retreat from Kabul in 1842 at the end of the First Anglo-Afghan War was arguably the worst British military disaster of the 19th century. During the Second Anglo-Afghan War, the British enforced the Treaty of Gandamak upon the Afghans in 1879. This treaty stipulated that whilst the Afghan Emir could maintain his own internal rule, control of the country's foreign affairs would be the prerogative of British India. In return, the Afghan Emir would receive British protection as well as an annual subsidy, thereby essentially being reduced to a dependency. In this time, the British were eager to officially demarcate Afghanistan's borders. In 1893, Amir Abdurrahman Khan, the man known as the Iron Emir, signed a contentious agreement with the British that produced the border between Afghanistan and British India, aka the Durrani Line. As a result of this line, the Pashtuns, the dominant ethnic group in Afghanistan, were split across two political entities. Like so many other colonial partitions, the arbitrariness of this line ensured that the spillover of tension still continues to this day between Afghanistan and the successor of British India, Pakistan. In 1901, Amir Habibullah came to power. Much softer than his father, he allowed the return of prominent exiled families. This is significant because returning families brought with them new ideas that the Afghanistan closed off by Amir Abdurrahman Khan did not yet have access to. Chief amongst this group was Mahmud Tarzi, who spent almost 2 decades in the Ottoman Empire. Through the editorship of his newspaper, Sirajul Akhbar, Tarzi propagated ideas that were wildly popular amongst the intellectuals of the colonized world. Everything from anti-imperialism to nationalism to Islamic modernism. Tarzi even developed a mentor-protege relationship with Prince Amanullah, who would go on to become his son-in-law. Issues of sovereignty and anti-imperialism were so popular in Afghanistan at this time that they were the uniting force bringing together the progressives and the conservative factions at the Afghan royal court. It wasn't hard to be annoyed if you were an Afghan nationalist in this time, considering the existence of things like the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. This was the agreement between Britain and Russia which officially brought an end to the Great Game by clearly demarcating zones of influence in Central Asia and Persia. All of this was done, however, without the consent of the countries they were acting on behalf of. Even Emir Habibullah was enraged that the agreement had been made without his nation's say-so. World War I proved to be a big test. Even though the German allied Ottoman Sultan called for Muslims to start a jihad against the Allies, Emir Habibullah held out, despite the outcry of the staunchly Muslim and anti-imperialist Afghan society. The Emir wanted independence, but was much more politically conservative than many of those at his court. He would pay for his conservatism with his life because shortly after World War I, he was assassinated. After a few days of rule from Nasrullah, Habibullah's brother, the enigmatic Amanullah would depose his uncle and accuse him of complicity in his father's murder. Although Habibullah's killers have never been revealed, Amanullah is as likely a suspect as anybody. But who killed Habibullah is not as important as why he was killed, because the why would reveal the course taken by his successor. You see, almost the entire royal court was united in their desire for complete independence from British India, and Habibullah was seen as an obstacle to that. His son Amanullah, under the guidance of the modernist-minded reformer Mahmud Tarzi, immediately set about to regain complete sovereignty over Afghan affairs. Pragmatically, Amanullah needed a way to unite the nation against a common foe, considering elements of the conservative status quo were unhappy about their new king for his modernist disposition and for the way he threw his uncle, the foremost conservative leader in the country, in prison. Nonetheless, it should not be undermined that there was widespread, one could almost say a national desire for independence. The historian Vartan Grigorian writes, "In 1919, no ruler could have succeeded in establishing a stronghold over the Afghan nation without pledging himself to the cause of total Afghan independence." And so in his very first royal proclamation, Amanullah vowed to lead his nation to total independence, a promise which was received very positively by the Afghan populace. By this time, the Third Anglo-Afghan War was inevitable. Amanullah sent a letter to the Viceroy of India that proclaimed the independence of his country. The response showed that the British did not take the new emir seriously, being slow to reply and vague in their response. And so, in early May 1919, Amanullah gave the order to invade British India. In the past, Afghan invasions of India had resulted in vast conquests and plunder. Their invasion this time came at a few different points along the frontier. Amanullah had hoped for a wide-scale Pashtun rebellion from his fellow Pashtun brethren across the Durand line in British India against their European colonizers. Some tribal support was forthcoming from the Waziris and Mahsuds, especially after the success of Nader Khan, commander-in-chief of the Afghan forces and future king, who was able to capture the fortress of Tal across the frontier in British India. But the British, always on their toes for a tribal Pashtun uprising, had adequately prepared for this in the months leading up to the war, and prevented large Pashtun tribes such as the Afridis and Mohmands from mobilizing. After initial Afghan success, the British were able to neutralize the Afghan threat. The British had more men, with better training and better weaponry. To the horror of the Afghans, they even bombed major Afghan cities like Kabul and Jalalabad. However, the British had just finished fighting in World War I and did not have the stomach for renewed conflict. In the face of stiff Afghan resistance, and the almost perennial danger of an uprising among the Pashtuns on the frontier, the British found it expedient to be on peaceful terms with the Afghans. So when the Afghans approached with an offer of an armistice in late May, the British gladly accepted. Both sides claimed victory, but considering the overwhelming disparity in the military capabilities of the two sides, it's clear that the Afghans had more to cheer about in light of the fact that they had forced the mighty British to the negotiating table. The end to the war was not as smooth sailing as it is often depicted. Negotiations dragged on for more than 2 years. Nonetheless, the Treaty of Rawalpindi was signed on August 8, 1919, and signalled a formal armistice. The Afghans, under their energetic foreign minister Mahmud Tarzi, almost immediately began a vigorous campaign of establishing bilateral relations with various states, thus raising their political legitimacy in the international community. The British would only come to recognize Afghanistan's independence 2 years later. The Anglo-Afghan Treaty was signed in 1921 with the complete recognition from the British that Afghanistan was now a sovereign and independent nation. But the Afghans had to pay a price. The Durrani Line was upheld as the official border delineating the two states. Nevertheless, even the final agreement itself was considered to be a temporary arrangement. The issue of the Durrani Line was in no way, shape or form put to rest. Indeed, it still plagues Afghan-Pakistani relations today. But the Anglo-Afghan War of 1919 had resulted in Afghanistan becoming one of, if not the only Muslim country at the time that was independent. Thank you guys for watching. I want to thank my patrons for always supporting. If you want to financially support Hikmah History, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Until next time, peace.